Hello and welcome to BOT. Nidal, Lakshit, Suman, and Manthan meet here to talk about the bits of tech as it relates to digital transformation. Tune in and enjoy. Hello, everyone. We are back. This time with the newest thing that is on our heads is fraud analytics. Uh, I was first agitated to even think about what we'll talk. But then as I started thinking, I think I can talk about for at least an hour alone to myself on fraud analytics, which I just did when I was getting ready. So what you're going to listen to is my thoughts, which I spoke to myself an hour ago. The first thing that came to my mind when we think about fraud analytics, right, was the captcha entry. Um, like if you would have noticed so far, my mind is a single track mind wherein I approach most things from a technology standpoint as to where it started, right? And the first most like the initial most application that I remember of actually getting to the idea of fraud without even knowing that there is something called as fraud, right? Was the captcha entry in my understanding, where it's not only username and password that you need to input, but also a captcha entry, right? Why? So that programs are not behaving like humans and trying to do human things on a website, right? Or on an app or any platform out there. So they came up with this concept of captcha where the numbers or the letters were so jumbled that a human being had to actually read it properly and then go from there. I would not be surprised if somebody came and told me that, hey, by the way, just use this plugin and all your captchas are taken care of. So there's a bot of bot, which kind of is the world we live in as far as fraud is concerned, right? But that is my initial idea of fraud and fraud prevention. Uh, we'll get more into the details, but there are two buckets in which all of this can be put into. One is proactive, the other is reactive. Proactive being the capture entry aspect that I just spoke about, right? And there are numerous other examples in how we use technology to just identify that the person on the other side of the screen is actually a person and not a cat typing on the keyboard, right? Um, the other aspect is being proactive about it, not only from a technology standpoint, but from a data standpoint as well, right? We'll dwell into this more, but I'd like to listen from you all, your opening dialogue on what your thoughts so far.
Great thoughts to kick us off, Manthan. I think you talked about several aspects there when it comes to proactive and reactive, and our topic for the day, fraud analytics. I would say this is just my personal opinion, but 75% importance should be given to the proactive approaches, and then 25% to the reactive approaches, right? So I think that there should be more focus on preventing fraud from occurring by learning from everything that has happened over the years. So it is very important to have the data from the past, but in order to have the fail safes in place and put that for the future, you need to have a proactive monitoring system. That's just my thought. That said, the other interesting aspect you mentioned is the capture, right? For identifying whether it is an actual human or not. That also triggered another interesting thought, which originally I was not thinking about, but when you mentioned capture, it reminded me of we've had in several other episodes we have had mentioned um, the upcoming phase out or deprecation of third party cookies. So just a quick sideway track on that topic before we come back to fraud analytics. Um, there is Google is building a new privacy sandbox, which is a set of APIs, a set of solutions that will help advertisers and online users and as even browsers to mitigate the absence of third party cookies. And one of the APIs there is, I think it is called the trust API or trust token API. I don't remember the exact name, but one of those APIs is essentially for browsers to communicate the status of whether a certain user can be trusted as a as an actual human or not, right? Using certain attributes. So without the use of third party cookies, right? So it is not a replacement for captchas, but it is a way to authenticate a user as as somebody who's real. So that's just something random that came to mind, but definitely relevant when it comes to fraud analytics, because identifying whether a user is an actual human being or a bot is one of the fundamental things. That said, I think the topic today is very relevant. It is not something that gained traction in the last year or two. It has always been there, essentially since ever since banking became digital, or even before that, at some point, right? So banking or the financial or insurance sectors have always seen the fraud analytics, like as they've always onboarded fraud analytics as one of the primary set of domains or industries. um, and it's very relevant. It is very much relevant, more relevant than ever with AI developing. And we have always seen, like, AI has both faces, right? There's the face that Elon Musk always talks about, which is the dangerous side of it. So yeah, it is very much important with new technologies building. I believe that even fraud analytics has to constantly evolve to address the new types of challenges that we've been facing. That's just my 2 cents to hopefully kick us all off in that direction. So I'd be curious to hear what you all have to say.
Thanks, Udal. Thanks for that introduction. Before I go, talk deeper about fraud analytics and all the preventive measures. What are the type of frauds? How and when? How can? What are the general use cases in fraud analytics? What are some of most common fraud tactics? Uh, just want to remind everybody about a couple of movies, TV series, or things that we've seen around. The most famous one that comes to my mind is Catch Me If You Can, Leonardo DiCaprio's movie. The premise of the entire movie, as fun as it is about fraud. Uh, how he finds certain loopholes in the system, exploits those loopholes, uses them to his advantage, does start with some gray areas, gets caught, then still makes his way out, and because he was so brilliant that he became like a police informant or a police consultant later, wherein he became the catalyst for catching those thieves who were doing fraud as well. Meaning, one of the biggest way of catching fraud is to let somebody from that same side come to over to your side. The other use case could, other shows could be like Scam, 1993. Again, those loophole, exploitation of the loophole. The movie, the TV show that we saw in Jamtara, how they were, doing out and out scam and fraud, where they were just printing out phone numbers and calling people. Still happens today. We have apps like Truecaller to help us with that. The length and breadth of fraud is practically as much as technology itself. Uh, it's how they say, like, it's the people who use the technology are responsible whether we use it for benefit of the world or for the fraud of it. Uh, People use technology for good and advanced purposes, but the same technology can be used for fraud and creating fraud purposes as well. For example, deepfake technology created for I don't know, still don't know what the real use case is, except somebody is sitting in their computer thinking, what's the most challenging task I can do is create a deepfake video. So I have one person's face on another, maybe like a TikTok filter or just a filter for some social media apps. That technology caught on so quick. People have now, I think there was one news I read about 200 million or money deposited in some Bangkok account or Hong Kong account, because the person at the other end thought that this was a CFO asking for that money, and that is how brilliant the technology was. We have practically new use cases coming up with deepfake technology every day, where we see presidents of the country of various countries and various nations addressing the nation, and but they're not the same guy. They're not the same people. It's just somebody else doing it for them and using deepfake technology. But this is still a little by far, and so these are some of the new technological advancements that are also creating concerns in people's mind, and hence there are always raising concerns over ethical use of technology in order to ensure that people are not being fraudulent about it. They're talking about responsible AI, ethical AI practices, uh, in order to ensure that the common people who are not as tech savvy cannot be used up, cannot be exploited for their innocence, and they can be saved from such fraud tactics that are now increasingly becoming more sophisticated and more difficult to capture, track, and prevent. We'll talk more about it in a while. In a while.
All right. So when Lakshit started speaking about movies and series, the first one that clicked was Jamtara for me, quite honestly. Quite a show. I would recommend everybody to watch that. So when we think about fraud, it's been there, right, since forever. It's just with the virtue of internet, we have access to quickly searching, okay, what were the recent frauds that happened, correct? And obviously, if we think post-pandemic, a lot of us have been using online transactions more versus your offline transactions, and thus a rise in fraud in online transactions as well. And one of the most famous one in the financial industry is account takeover fraud, right? So, but one of the interesting fact is also right before pandemic, there has been a 280% increase in account takeover fraud between the second quarter of 2019 and 20. Isn't that interesting? Even before, just right before COVID. And we might not imagine like 280% sharp shoot increases and it has been increasing year on year. So there's no stoppage, right? Despite all the preventive measures that we have in place. And the interesting thing is with these kind of frauds, where a customer data has been stolen, 15 billion stolen credentials are available on dark web. So anybody who has access to it, and the cyber criminals, for a customer, they pay on an average $15 for the credentials, and they pay approximately around $3,000 USD for an organization's key systems. So you see, it's easily accessible. So, I mean, as a person, also, I might have clicked on some irrelevant link and lost money. This happened recently. So I was going to watch a show, like a boxing match, and then the ticket prices were like humongous. So I just went there, was looking for it, checked at the kiosk, and then looked up online. I found the price to be literally half, and I was just about to click on the link. And thankfully I didn't, because of my husband, or else I think we would have lost easily around $500 that day. So there's so many clickbaits that's happening, right? Even today, when the technology has reached where it has, in terms of all the measures, let me give quick examples of the industries and will be mind blown in terms of the data breach that's happening. Right, the first one being as recent as April 2024, which is this month itself, US government data breach has happened by a Siberian hacking group, and they have stolen highly confidential data. Most of the data breach that is happening is actually a ransomware attack. So it just depends, whether a company wants to pay or not. In February, the previous month, there was a Bank of America data breach, which impacted 57,000 customers, right? There's Trello data breach. Trello is a project management software platform, and data of 15 million users was stolen. Let me give you another interesting example. Victoria Court Systems data breach. A court based out of Victoria in Australia was hacked, and the unauthorized parties, which is the hackers, had gained access to various court recordings. Can we even think about this? Right? Then there's Norton Healthcare data breach, which impacted 2.5 million people in Kentucky, and data of 40 clinics was stolen. There's Boeing data breach, the aircraft manufacturer, Boeing. There was a data breach there itself. And I mean, they just, in the newspaper articles, it was just a cyber incident has happened. That's how it was published. But we don't know what exactly went in there, right? Uh, Indian Council of Medical Research data breach. So all of us have taken vaccines, I'm assuming. 800 million Indian citizens' data may have been exposed uh, specifically regarding to the COVID health care. Then there's Ontario birth registry data breach, wherein 3.4 million people's data was stolen. So if we think about these, it's not usual. So when we think about fraud analytics, the first thing that comes up on our mind is just banking or financial, right? Wherein people are losing money. But on the hindsight, all of these attacks are also happening. And if I think about it, there are two key things. Number one, an organization, what sort of governance policies do they have in place? And number two, just as normal, regular people, how can we be very alert in terms of everything? I mean, to the best of our capability, keeping our data secure, because our data is also online and on various portals. How can we keep that secure through, let's say, strong passwords or anything, right? So it has to be on both the ends, not just the organization's responsibility, but also ours. So these are the mind-blowing facts. I'm happy to hear more from y'all.
Yeah, I mean, those examples that you just stated, right, Suman, are great. And I think as we spoke, there might be like at least 5 more examples, right? And as I spoke that statement, there might be 2 more. That's the world we live in, right? It's a constant uh, battle between the lock and the key, right? You have to first build a lock that nobody can unlock without the key. And then the key maker will build a key that will open every lock. And then you'll again build another lock. That's how encryption grew over years, right? Um, it's always that. It's like there would be no security if there were no breaches, right? Think about it this way: like if I were to take a hacker an anti-hacking course, or if I were to build an anti-hacking organization, the first person I need to hire is a very good hacker, right? That's the irony of this. It's literally a chicken and egg situation where if you get an egg, the chicken is compromised. And if you do not get an egg, then there's nothing to eat, right? What do we do? Like, there are fraud companies whose core business is just this, right? Here are the number of frauds we detected. As a result of this, here are the number of technical advancement uh, that we propose, and here is how our solutions, our SaaS solutions, etc., will do it. There are two ways to think about it. One is that where most companies today start, let's say that I'm a small company of 10 people, where I would mostly start is at data not going out of my organization, right? That's, I think when we say fraud, most people or many people would end up thinking that. But that's not even an application, right? That should be an obvious thing. It's like all the gold that I have should stay in my home or in my bank. It should not be going out. That's obvious. In this case, the gold is our data, right? The first point is that the obvious that we're talking about is not so obvious, right? A telecaller who's working in the bank today, this is the hard reality of the world we live in, right? A telecaller who's working in the bank today has access to the banking data of people who are millionaires in a given geography, right? Now, yes, that person is restricted by the software systems internally in a in banking scenario where they cannot run X queries and cannot manipulate X data or cannot click a screenshot or all of those. But guess what? The data is in front of me. All I need is a photographic memory or a little bit of memory to memorize 5 account numbers, right? And I can do a lot out of that. That's the world we live in. It is a human dependent world. Where encryption comes in is that we take the human element out of it, meaning that it is a system which is talking to another system based on a backend code, which is the brain, right? And no actual information gets exchanged with a human intervention. It's only the systems which are talking to each other. This is where we have gotten. The irony of this is the same lock and key that I mentioned. People, as you were saying in your example, Suman, the data breach is happening either at the client side or at the server side, enough that these systems are not able to like sustain itself, right? You could have your cable under wire in an ocean, but the technology and or people are smart enough to just put a pin in that wire and get things out there. I'll give a very silly example of fraud, all right? The silliest that came to my mind, and this goes beyond captcha, so I'm contradicting my own point. There used to be a time where cable TV was connected with antennas, right? And there were people who could just put an additional wire for somebody who has that connection. And let's say I don't have that connection. I'll just put an additional wire, bring it to my home, and now I have the cable. That is fraud in its full essence, where data is being sent over a frequency, and I'm just tapping into that frequency to be able to get access to that on-air data, right? And if I structure my antenna in a certain way, I'll get more channels, right? That's the world the 90s kids came from. So all Gen Zs may not be able to relate, but this used to be a real thing. I've done it myself, right? That is fraud 101. What they did to prevent this was earlier there were only copper wires. Then they brought fiber optic was brought in such that the data could not be breached that easily, right? So this is another example of fraud detection and prevention. As I was saying, if nobody had put that wire to take that for free, we would not have upgraded from the copper cables to the fiber optic, right? That's the whole idea of fraud analytics as well. So to sum up what I'm trying to say, in our world, one is the proactive aspect of it, where we will do a lot of things on the client side, which is on the website itself, saying that, hey, right click is prohibited. You cannot right click here. You cannot read into my JavaScript code, or you cannot use a SQL injection, right? SQL injection is basically putting such values in a field that the system is thinking that it is a select star query, right? And the return that you get won't be entire database, right? So preventing those things on the client side versus doing things on the server side itself, uh, which in a telecom industry, as Lakshit was saying, the Truecaller, right? It's a server side application where I'm saying that, hey, this number coming from this area code has these many frauds reported, right? Whatever that core logic be. I've not done enough research to be able to speak to that logic, but you're getting proactively while the call is still not being picked up, you're being told that, hey, this is likely a fraud, right? That's the world where we want to get to, but we are very far from it. There is this practice called as cyber squatting. That is a technical term. In simple terms, it's like mimicking someone else's content, right? That is happening in so many ways. Like somebody could take a screenshot of this, put 4 different faces on this video, and this could very well become their podcast. Change the background, right? That's the part where we've gotten to already. Uh, there are governments which are passing laws for prevention of this, such that all of these things are punishable by law. I think that's one way of looking at prevention, because it's like, hey, everybody has a knife, but does everybody go out and do the wrong things with the knife? They don't. It's the same thing. That's the idealistic way of preventing these frauds, right? That if you do a fraud of data or any kind, it is punishable by law. While we still continue to do the chicken and egg or the lock and key, where we just continue to build better locks and better keys. That's where I see this going.
Love the great analogies there. I think, it is always more relatable when we talk about, those experiences and how some of these advanced concepts have sometimes very basic explanations when you relate it with the day-to-day scenario that you've seen when growing up, for instance. I want to also talk about, a certain aspect that you mentioned. You mentioned telecallers having access to a lot of information, probably more information than they should have access to, and them utilizing it for the wrong reasons, right? When it comes to fraud, we generally think of use cases where somebody who's wearing a mask, like a hacker is someone who comes to mind. Someone with no face, someone who you cannot trust, and then coming in as an external, no association with the company or no association with the customer, and then they are taking part in those fraudulent activities. But it can very well also be the case that someone within the organization that you trust, the organization that you are interacting with, the organization that you're sharing your data with, maybe where you have your bank account, can even be part of it, right? I don't know. I know, Manthan Suman, you're based in Canada. You might have probably heard about one of the biggest heists and a few criminals who got caught very recently. Some gold bars were seized, and it came to note that there were insiders involved, right? As part of
Yeah.
that. I'm just using that as an example, essentially to say that people who have access to that data are always the ones that have like the key, right? And then if they have the wrong intent, it can be used in ways that are even untraceable because they know how to wipe off their tracks. And that's what I want to say when I mentioned that fraud is not only applicable to end users. It can also be not just externals, it can even be employees, right? Employee fraud is a thing, and it can be for several cases, such as unauthorized use of company resources, or falsifying very basic use cases such as falsifying your timesheets to get paid overtime, right? Or utilize insider trading is another example for there was a case I was reading about, or a news, where a husband was making money off of the stock market by just listening into his wife's meetings, and she used to take meetings from home, right? So he was just listening in. His wife was never aware that this was going on, but all of the information that he was just listening to from those calls, he was involved in fraud. But those are just some examples, essentially to say that employee fraud is also one similar concern. I want to dive a bit deeper into the different industries where fraud analytics is one of the necessity, and then frauds are like more common than others. For example, we all know about finance and insurance, and we talked about credit card fraud or identity theft as some of the use cases in the finance industry. When it comes to insurance, staged accidents or false claims, sometimes exaggerated damages, can be some of the common cases for fraud in an insurance industry. I'd like to relate it with something that is very recent here in Dubai. I'm based out of Dubai, so we had recent rains. A lot of vehicles got damaged, and people are raising insurance claims because natural disaster. My car got stuck in the water, so I need the damages repaid. And I see another set of people who are trying to make the best out of this time and say that their car never exited the apartment, but they are trying to claim using that the window of this time right now to just account for or use that for their advantage and get some repairs done within that window, right? So every company needs to protect themselves against these type of instances, and that's where I'll basically stop with one statement. For a fraud analyst or a fraud investigator, one of the most important aspects to understand is the detection of patterns, and that is not when you're dealing with large amounts of data, it is not possible to do that manually. That's where you use machine learning algorithms, you use, existing SaaS platforms or APIs to ingest large amount of data, look at historical data versus present, and then try to figure out patterns, try to connect the dots, create a graph representation of the interconnected elements, the past transactions, any random transaction, look at different parameters of that transaction, the location, the timestamp, the history of the person who performed that transaction, and then put that into a fraud detection model, and then try to understand what is the possibility of this being a fraud. And then you have several outcomes. If everything looks good, just proceed as it is. If something looks questionable, block it there. And if something requires a full manual review, then send it to one of the fraud investigators who will approve it prior to the flow proceeding to the next stage. So the pattern analysis is one of the key, I think, elements within fraud. I'll stop at that thought. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as well.
Sure. So let me just start off with an example. Last year, when I visited India, after almost 1.5 years, I had my itinerary planned. So I wanted to go from city A to city B, then city C, back to city A, then city D. That's how it was planned. And then I started booking my tickets online. Okay. So let's say I went to Vistara and I started booking my tickets, and I was using my online banking to do the same. The first transaction went just fine. I booked my ticket. When I went on to the second transaction, I immediately started getting call from my bank. Third transaction, again, I got call from my bank. Fourth transaction, again, I got a call from my bank. And why is this happening? This is called as behavioral analysis that is done. The bank knows that someone didn't have any sort of transactions, or bare minimum, like probably just mobile recharges or something like that, just very of a very little amount was done in the past 1.5 years. And how come suddenly she's spending thousands of rupees while booking her flights? So this is one of the best use cases that we can think of in terms of preventing a fraud, right? And it's done using behavioral analysis, like user profiling, identity verification, detecting unusual behavioral patterns, as you just mentioned, Nidal, right? There are other type of analysis as well, which is done in this space. So we know predictive analytics and what it will do. There's also text analytics, wherein we read the emails, customer reviews, communication logs to detect any suspicious activity, right? And that's done to also understand the sentiment analysis and fraudulent claim detections, just to name a few. So if we think of a framework, right, what are the general steps that will happen when we're solving a problem like this? The base is the same when you solve any other, even if you're doing a customer segmentation versus this, your base is going to be the same. So first step is obviously data collection that we do. Let's consider a use case of supply chain unauthorized access fraud. Okay. So how will we, using this framework, how can we just go about solving this as a problem? First is obviously data collection. So we can have access log, we can collate user activity logs, your inventory records, your transaction data. The second step is going to be data pre-processing, when you're handling your missing value, just pre-processing your data, right? Transformation, normalization, and all of that. The third step, and the crucial step again, is an EDA, exploratory data analysis, wherein that's when your first level and a strong level of pattern detection comes into picture, along with ensuring and understanding what data quality are you working with. Okay. Fourth is going to be feature engineering, wherein you would be creating new features or variables based on your current data, which will contribute to detecting the unauthorized access fraud. Okay. Fifth is going to be anomaly detection. We can use any unsupervised machine learning algorithm like your isolation forest, one class SVM, autoencoders as an example. And then you can set appropriate threshold to identify suspicious activity. So as an example, if I, though it's a supply chain example that I'm speaking about here, but if I quickly relate to correlate to the banking example, which would be common for all of us, is that the bank knew that someone has not been making any transaction. So if she makes any transaction which is above, let's say, 10,000 rupees, then what is the action that we're supposed to take? Correct. So that's anomaly detection that we're working with. The sixth step is obviously model development, wherein what is it that we're trying to do here? We're trying to prevent it. So we will be using some predictive algorithms. We can use machine learning, supervised machine learning algorithms like your random forest, gradient boosting, split your data into training and testing, and then you're done with that. The seventh is going to be your model evaluation. You look at the accuracies and scores, and then you validate your models. Eighth is going to be deployment and real-time monitoring. So this is the first time when you have already built your fraud model and now you are going to be deploying it in your system. It could be a cloud deployment or on your server, and then you will start noting how well it is integrating with your existing security systems. Not exactly in terms of the way that we're working here, right? Ninth is going to be a feedback loop and continuous improvement, because as models, the base that we work on, which is the training data, might be really good, but when you deploy it, it might just fail, like badly fail. So we want to learn through that and then improvise continuously so that we're doing the right thing there. And the 10th is obviously you would be doing some sort of documentation and reporting, as well as compliance and data governance, which will be in place even for the modeling part. So one is obviously at a company level that we spoke about, like that Manthan spoke about earlier. And the second is while we are building a fraud analytics model, predictive model, how can we go about doing that? So the framework to an extent remains the same, obviously depending on the industry and data. The way we solve the problem might differ a bit. If I take a quick example of healthcare industry, the type of data that we work with will change, right? There's going to be claims data, as Nidal just mentioned about the claims thing, right? Then you'll be using billing records, your pharmacy data, your patient information as an example, and that's the data that you're working with. If it's banking, the most common one that we're aware of, it's going to be your transactional log, your customer information, your account details, credit card, debit card. And that's the data that we work with and then build the relevant model and the use case, right? Just to sum it up with another example, because it's banking is where we stop the buck at. So my husband and I went for kayak last year, and to be able to do that, the rule was obviously that we give them the credit card, our credit card, and we gave it. We had a blast. We came back, nothing. At the end of the day, when we were home, we saw there was an airline ticket booked worth $3,000, and we had no idea how did this happen. And obviously, there were hundreds of people who were kayaking. So you can assume 100. If let's just assume 100 people. Even if it's like 50 families, that means 50 credit cards were given at the shop, right? At the kiosk where they were helping us with everything. So we were surprised. And that's the first time when we face something like this. It's a legit place where you're doing kayaking, but $3,000, gone, absolutely. So, and then you go back to the bank, try to reconcile as much as you can. So these things are actually happening in basic day-to-day activities where we cannot even comprehend it. But there are ways and mechanisms to solve. And that's it's just about putting the best foot forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to share one of my experiences as well, which was due to fraud prevention mechanisms in place, I was not able to spend, but that is not as bad as an experience as compared to like actually losing money because the necessary fraud prevention mechanism wasn't in place. So my experience was, I was traveling to a new country, and I was trying to make a transaction for security deposit while renting a car, and the transaction got declined because my bank thought it was a fraudulent activity, right? Now, this is where I want to talk about. I think Suman detailed a very good set of process steps to have a good fraud analytics or a fraud detection mechanism in place. And one of the last steps there, I think, is a very important one, which is continuous improvement, right? So I was recently going through a video by Visa, which is, Visa in your cards, in your debit cards or your credit cards. Visa has had a fraud detection um, mechanism in place since many years. It's foundational for a business like Visa to have a fraud detection mechanism, and one of the and they extensively use AI for that, and one of the important elements there is continuous improvement. You need to consistently feed more data into it and determine that certain transactions, even though it might look like fraud at the first look, it might not necessarily be, because the world is constantly changing, consumer behavior is constantly changing. You have people who are traveling more extensively than before. It's the age of social media, it's the age of remote work, where people can just travel while they work, and then one day they're in one place and in another day they are in a different city, different country that is miles away. Transport, ways to transport is also evolving, right? So it's not necessary that if you had a rule-based fraud detection system which said you cannot go from, for example, Germany to Japan in so many hours before, that law or that rule might get outdated when you have a faster so fundamental rules like how quickly a person can transport between two places, right? So that's where one of the examples from Visa and how they use their AI systems to continuously improve fraud detection is very relevant, because they generally have clusters of consumers who behave in a certain manner. For example, you might go cliff diving on one day, and the immediate next day you're traveling to a different country, and you're using your credit card for paying something else, making a taxi ride, or all of these behaviors, the trends, what people tend to do next can seem very weird when you're actually observing the actual data, but then it can happen, right? It is possible. So all of this is evaluated with different parameters in place, and then looking at what is the probability of this being a fraud. If it is high, then yes, it definitely needs to get flagged. But continuous improvement and constantly feeding that data in, that feedback mechanism, is very important to build a very robust model.
Cool. So, basically summarizing everything that we all spoke about, and, just to take a cue from basically Manthan's chicken and egg problem, you talking about the continuous improvement, someone talking about all the details about fraud prevention methods, basically point to the same thing, that one system alone cannot, A, do everything, B, uh, see, we have to understand that all companies must approach fraud analytics or fraud detection as an absolute certainty, meaning every system can be breached, and every person on the planet is out to breach a system. You have to assume and build a system like that so that you can continuously improve it. Some companies deploy their own hackers, their own teams within their own systems to, breach the systems. There are IT in infosec policies that actually go about, breaking their own system. They hire hackers, ethical hackers as they call it, to try and breach their own system so that they can build better systems out of it. uh, in my opinion, there are three broad categories that I would, classify fraud prevention tactics to be under. Would be awareness, prevention, and encryption. Fraud cannot just be one person's responsibility. It has to be a collective effort. The users themselves have to be very careful about what they share. The companies have to be careful about what system they create in order to prevent any unauthorized access or usage of their data. And worst case, even if the systems are breached, how can they minimize the impact of their breach? That's the third preventive measure. You would also realize that in a today's day and age where we are talking about privacy and concern, we're also encouraging a lot of our advertisers, a lot of our clients, systems, B2B systems, to ask clients for their 1P data, because of course all third-party cookie data is deprecating, or non-robust or non-user IDs are being deprecated, and we're moving towards an age where companies are incentivizing users to provide their 1P data as much as they can, as broadly as they can. But what we also need to take into account is that while companies take this 1P data, they be very careful about it, how they're processing the data. There are various security certificates awarded to each company based on their data processing and collection capabilities. There are many infosec reviews. These certificates are renewed either yearly, quarterly, sometimes twice a year, once in 2 years or 3 years, and they have expiration certificates. They have to renew these certificates based on the technology changes, based on the geo region they are in. So if you're in the European region, then of course the laws will be slightly different over data collection and processing technology as compared to if you're in Asia or America. So you have to also take into account that the data that you collect within your system remains encrypted. So just like we were calling, like telecallers can memorize the numbers, why not encrypt it on their systems completely? Encrypt it so that they can't memorize it. The best only thing they can do is click on a call button, and only the system makes the connection between encrypted value, the real value, and actually makes a call. It's a system technology that's actually also being used in a lot of our Uber Olas, where the moment they call us or we call them, the number is not actually the one they see on the screen. It's a redirected number that gets called over. So, and then prevention or encryption. This also ensures that even if in the worst case scenario breach happens, and hackers or people do get their hands on customer data, that customer data cannot be consumed by them or read by them. It has to be ensured that it is encrypted. It's like the Russian doll problem. You have one-way encryption models today that cannot be decrypted. They cannot be decrypted. They can only be encrypted by one system. Ensure that the one master system is secure, offline, cut off from the rest of the world. Nothing can breach it, and only whatever few people can use it. Of course, if those people get hacked, is a different matter. That that's a different conversation altogether. But if there's a master system that keeps all these confidential data secure in an isolated place and location where it cannot be breached, all the data from that system can then be encrypted and passed over to your regular marketing systems or operations systems that can be used by your employees in order to run the daily operations of the business. So broadly classifying awareness towards the customers to ensure that they're providing consent, that they are providing responsible data to responsible people. uh, I mean, sometimes they get fluked by, like what Suman said. She went kayaking. They have to give away the cards. Most of the times when you're booking tickets, or when we are going to hotels, we have to provide our Aadhaar cards and PAN cards. They make a copy of it. We don't know what it gets used for later. They don't destroy it. So destruction of data is also important. And there needs to be there's a very new policy by the government that has come up. It's a great policy that they have come up, is where they are encrypting, I think, the first four or the first 8 digits of our Aadhaar card and PAN card. So even in the physical card, they won't actually show you the number. So even if they make a copy of it, nobody can use it but you. So you continue to have the online copy of it. Any physical copies continue to have the encrypted and masked data value. So government policies, user policies, users' own education and awareness ensure that we're not sharing our data irresponsibly everywhere. B, the companies need to ensure that they have the right certificates and the right IT reviews and the right data processing capabilities, that they're doing right by their customers in order to ensure that no unethical or unauthorized access to data is avoided in any case possible. Isolate the systems, isolate your master systems, use encrypted values across your systems. Uh, think like breach will happen. Always think like that. Create your systems assuming breach will happen, and build them robust, build them strong. Try and breach yourself and see that you cannot. build the system to the best of your capability. Think like a hacker. Build the systems to the best of your capability. Ensure that they are not hacked. See preventive measures. See what think about solutions that even if breach happens, how can we minimize it? How can we minimize the damage done? How fast can we react? How fast can we reduce the damage to end users? So if we can classify all these three in an ecosystem, in my opinion, the companies are now moving towards a combination of these three systems in order to reduce such fraudulent activities. And technology will, of course, be the key, will be the accelerant in reducing these fraud capabilities. But having said that, the faster we evolve, the faster the technology evolves, the faster the loopholes will be, because the people who understand those systems will be lesser and lesser, and people who would exploit the system would just need to be very few insiders, as Nidal mentioned, to just exploit the loopholes in the system. So, best of luck to all of our engineers for creating such systems, and cheers. And I hope nobody goes through having the pain of going through some fraudulent activities themselves.
Picking up of your point, right, Lakshit, in the speed aspect of it, I'll throw in an interesting scenario there, right? The whole problem of fraud today is the speed at which the data gets available, right? I'm making a transaction at a merchant site, and that transaction is not available to my bank up until X hours, right? Or in the banking ERP system or in the banking CRM system, right? Whichever that be. That's the whole problem. Why is this not problem, this obvious problem not being solved at the pace which we would like? The the underscore to all of what we've said so far is the cost of it, right? At times, the cost of fraud is so much that the fraud itself would not cost you, right? Like earlier, let's say 10 years ago, if I were to build a business and if I were to take it online, all I need to do is build a website. Or if I were to do more, I would also build an app. These were the steps to go online. Now, fraud is an essential part of going online, meaning that your website should have X certificates, which is obviously there, the SSL certificates for an example, but also the fact that your website, which is talking to your database, does not allow any sort of breach, right? So these things cost. What I think, people who are not into core tech may fail to realize is that everything that we do on tech is a cost. A very simple example of this is one of my friend who thought that all passwords, as Lakshit was saying, all passwords are accessible and can be breached. So what he did was he always wrote a random string, an absolute random string, right? A lengthy random string as a password, and kept clicking forgot password every time he wanted to log in. And then with the security questions, they would get to the account and then again set a password which is like they don't know themselves. Now think of this. If that person was logging into their, just as an example, their Gmail account 30 times in a month, then the cost of clicking on that forgot password is being borne by the Gmail server, right? And if this was to be marked as a fraud, then that fraud system will also incur a cost. So cost is the underscore for why most systems are not in its ideal state. Of course, it should be and it will be, but that's not the core business. The core business for all companies is not preventing fraud. It is doing that core business. For example, selling t-shirts, right? That's where the gap right now is, and it can only be breached with technology, but that technology comes with its own cost. So that's a challenge that remains to be solved, as I was saying. But this was a great dialogue on fraud analytics. Thank you, Suman, for the elaborate examples. I was just thinking that we have not spoken about how algorithms are being used to prevent all of that. So, if anybody was looking for solutions other than mostly me ranting out on problems, please listen to the Suman's component of what solutions could apply. We can absolutely have another round of fraud analytics after this because I think there is a lot to unpack there. But this is a good one. So, thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.